The night my daughter-in-law removed me from my own grandson's baptism, I did not shout. I did not break a plate. I did not drive to their house and demand an explanation. I did not forward the text to Garrison with a long, wounded message about everything I had sacrificed for that family. I sat on my couch with my phone in my hand, staring at 6 words that told me exactly what I had become to these people. Your presence doesn't match the aesthetic. That was how Cordelia Pelham Ashcroft Thornberry informed me, at 9:47 on a Sunday night, that I was no longer welcome at Theodore's baptism, not because I had behaved badly at a family event, not because I had said something unforgivable, not because anyone had sat me down, looked me in the eye, and told me there was a problem we needed to solve together, but because a self-made man from Dorchester, a grandfather who had personally funded every single element of that ceremony, apparently did not photograph well enough for the image she had spent a year carefully constructing. My name is Wallace Thornberry. I am 67 years old. I built a real estate company worth more than $200 million from nothing but calloused hands, 4 o'clock mornings, and a refusal to stay poor. And in that moment, sitting in my living room with the television still on and the sound no longer reaching me, I finally understood the truth. They had wanted my money at the table. They had never wanted me. But to understand why that hurt the way it did, you first need to understand who my son used to be. Garrison had always been a good boy. Quiet. Steady. The kind of kid who carried his mother's grocery bags without being asked and remembered the things other people forgot. I put him through Boston College, then through Georgetown Law, and he came back to Boston as a tax attorney at a respected firm in the city. After my wife, Lorraine, passed in 2019, Garrison and I grew closer than we had been in years. Every Sunday, he drove out to my house in Milton with a bottle of red wine. We watched football, talked about his cases, laughed about old memories, argued about nothing that mattered. For a while, it felt like grief had left us with something small but real. Then Cordelia arrived. Cordelia Pelham Ashcroft. The hyphenated last name should have been my first warning. She came from one of those old Beacon Hill families that never stopped reminding people their bloodlines stretched back to 1635. Her father sat on the boards of 3 private clubs, 2 of which happened to be in buildings I owned. Her mother ran a charitable foundation that distributed other people's money and accepted credit for the generosity. Cordelia was beautiful. I will give her that without hesitation. But she was cold in a very specific way. Not cruel, not obvious. Just perpetually. Precisely cold the way a room is cold when someone leaves the window open and refuses to close it. The first time Garrison brought her to Milton, she walked through my house like an appraiser, deciding whether the property was worth saving. She picked up a framed photograph of Lorraine and me on Cape Cod and said, "Oh, this is sweet. Is this from when you used to vacation?" Used to. Past tense. As if Lorraine's death had reduced my life to something that no longer qualified for the present. He let it go. I let a great many things go after that. All of them in the name of keeping peace and keeping Garrison happy. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet alarm had already started ringing. Because I had been in business long enough to know this particular kind of cold. I had seen it before. In partnerships. In boardrooms. In men who smiled during the negotiation and changed the terms after the ink was dry. Cordelia had decided what I was worth. And she had decided before she had finished the handshake. When Theodore was born, something shifted inside me that I had not been prepared for. I had been a father. I knew what it felt like to hold a child and watch the rest of the world shrink down to one small breathing thing. But being a grandfather was different. It was softer. It moved through me slowly, like light coming through old glass. I drove to Massachusetts General before sunrise, the morning Cordelia went into early labor. I sat in that waiting room for 9 hours, which I am not ashamed to admit. I had my hands folded in my lap, and I was not sure if I was praying or simply trying not to break down in front of strangers. When Garrison finally came through the door and asked if I wanted to meet my grandson, I cried. Right there in the corridor. In front of the nurses and the chairs and the fluorescent lights. I cried the way I had not cried since I stood at the edge of Lorraine's grave and understood that some absences are permanent. By the following morning, Theodore had a $300,000 college fund in his name. Then came the handmade crib, the boutique pediatrician I arranged introductions for, the nursery renovation I paid for, Ewan and, finally, the house I purchased in Wellesley, 3 blocks from where Garrison and Cordelia lived. So I could be close. I told myself I was helping, but at some level I was not fully honest about. I was doing something else. I was writing checks as insurance. I was buying continuity. I was paying for the right to be needed. The baptism was scheduled for the second Sunday in October, at the Church of the Advent on Beacon Hill, with a reception to follow at the Pelham Ashcroft family home. Cordelia described the event the way someone announces a formal state occasion carefully, with an awareness of how each detail reflected on the family name. I saw the invoices before I ever saw the guest list. $65,000. 4 hours. For a child who was 11 months old and still clapped whenever he caught sight of a ceiling fan. The caterer was a Charles Street firm charging $300 a plate. The flowers had been ordered from a supplier who flew them in from Europe, which I only discovered when I read the freight line item. There was a photographer with 2 assistants, a string quartet hired to play Bach during the ceremony, custom linens, rental seating, a baptism gown sourced from a boutique in London that cost more than my first automobile. I paid for every line of it, not because anyone had called me and said, "Dad, we're a little stretched this month. Could you help?" Not because Garrison sat me down over that Sunday wine and asked me plainly. Cordelia's mother had sent me a 16-page document bound in cream-colored cardstock with the family crest embossed on the cover. It described itself as a budget consultation document. It explained that the Pelham Ashcrofts had encountered unexpected obligations and would warmly appreciate my stewardship of the financial particulars. Stewardship. That was the word they chose for my checkbook. I should have asked questions right then. I should have looked at that document and wondered why a family with traditions old enough to brag about publicly needed a man they barely acknowledged to quietly fund them. I should have heard the polished language for what it was, an invoice dressed up in good manners and a family crest. But Garrison sounded embarrassed when I brought it up. Theodore was my grandson, so I signed the check and told myself it was love. The text came 1 week before the baptism, on a Sunday night, at 9:47. I was half watching football. Cordelia's name appeared on my screen, and I assumed it was a last-minute logistics detail. Perhaps a change in the arrival time, or a note about where I should park. What I got instead was 6 words that rearranged everything. Your presence doesn't match the aesthetic we've been building with Father Caldwell and the photographer. We've rescheduled you out of the day. I read it once, then again, then a third time, moving through each word slowly, because my brain kept sliding off the meaning. The way a hand slides off a wet railing. My grandson's baptism had an aesthetic, and I was not in it. Not Wallace Thornberry, the grandfather. Not the man who had driven to the hospital before dawn. Not the man who had cried in the corridor and set up a college fund by the following morning and bought a house 3 blocks away just to be close. To Cordelia and her family, I was the check that had already cleared. And now that the money was safely in place, the man who had written it was a decorative problem. I wish I could tell you that I slammed the phone down and drove straight to their house. But I did not do any of that. I sat there in my living room for 40 minutes without moving, with the game still on and the sound still running and none of it reaching me at all. Then I called Garrison. He did not answer. I called again. Voicemail. I sat with that silence for another 20 minutes. It was a different kind of hurt than the text had delivered, because I had learned to expect a certain shallowness from Cordelia. She had always viewed me through the lens of what I represented rather than who I was. But Garrison had stood beside me at his mother's grave. I had held him through pneumonia when he was small. I had known every version of him. His silence was not an accident. It was a decision. His text arrived 20 minutes later. Dad, I know you got Cordelia's message. Can we talk tomorrow? It's late and I'm exhausted. I looked at that message for a long time. Then I typed one sentence back. Tell me yes. Or, no. Are you in agreement with this? An hour passed before his answer came. It's complicated, Dad. And that was when I understood. My son had not been ambushed by Cordelia. He had not been cornered or manipulated into something he could not escape. He had made a choice. And then he had chosen comfort over honesty. And then he had let the night go quiet and hoped I would accept it the same way I had accepted everything else. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table while the neighborhood went still, with a legal pad in front of me and a pen in my hand. When something in business stops making sense, there is one discipline that restores clarity. You make a list. So I wrote down everything I had provided since Theodore's birth. The college fund, the crib, the pediatrician, the nanny arrangement, the nursery, the house purchase, the London baptism gown, the caterer, the flowers, the photographer, the string quartet, the rented chairs and the custom linens. The number that looked back at me when I added it up was $460,000 across 10 months. Then I kept writing. Everything since the wedding. The down payment on their first home, the furniture, the cars, the 14 months Cordelia spent on her career sabbatical after they married, the trips to France, the quiet expenses that had no category other than keeping things smooth. By 4 a.m, the total exceeded $1 million. And for the first time, I stopped calling it generosity. What I had actually been doing was buying my position. I had been paying, year after year, for the right to stand near people who were quietly embarrassed by me. Every check I wrote was not a gift. It was an apology for existing. At 4 a.m, I called Beverly. Beverly Okafor had been my executive assistant since 1998. Calling her an assistant was like calling an architect, someone who draws lines. She held my calendar, managed my office, ran the operational center of my company, and possessed a quality that I had never seen duplicated: the ability to find the one sentence in a contract that everyone else was too exhausted or too impressed to notice. She answered on the second ring. Wallace, she said, her voice rough. It is 4 a.m. I know. I said, I'm sorry. Pause. What happened? I read her Cordelia's text. Every word of it. The aesthetic, the rescheduling, the smooth, polite execution of a man from the family he had funded. When I finished, Beverly said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, Wallace, I have watched you end business relationships with men richer than God for less disrespect than this. Why does your daughter-in-law get to do what no partner, banker, or tenant has ever survived? I had no answer, because the answer was not complicated. Cordelia was not powerful. She was not influential. She did not have leverage over me in any measurable sense. What made her powerful was Garrison's silence. And what made Garrison's silence possible was my habit of absorbing it. Beverly finally said, be in the office by 7. Bring every invoice, every contract, every record of what you've paid for that baptism. Why? Her voice shifted into the register she used when she had already seen 3 moves ahead. Because I want to know exactly what world you've been funding. By 10 that morning, Beverly had assembled the full picture. The Church of the Advent was in active lease negotiations with one of my buildings. The caterer had operated under a long-standing vendor relationship with my firm. The florist rented commercial space from me. The photographer had shot my company's annual reports for 6 consecutive years. The bank holding the Pelham Ashcroft family mortgage had me on its board. Cordelia had built her perfect Beacon Hill baptism inside a world that I had largely constructed. She had assumed that world was simply there. The way people who inherit privilege assume the floor will hold them without asking who poured the foundation. At 11 that morning, I called Garrison. He answered on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting. Dad, I'm glad you called, he said. His voice had the careful energy of a man who had rehearsed the opening. Look, I know last night was rough, but the spirit of the thing, I said, is that I am not welcome at my own grandson's baptism. He exhaled. Dad, the Pelham Ashcrofts have traditions going back generations. Father Caldwell has a specific way of conducting ceremonies. And Cordelia's mother feels strongly that... Garrison, I said, yes or no? Am I welcome at Theodore's baptism? Silence? I waited. I could hear him breathing. I could hear the sound of papers shifting in the background, which meant he was in his office, which meant he had probably been sitting at his desk since early morning. Building his case, he said. Finally, Cordelia's mother feels strongly that the day should reflect the family's traditions. There is going to be a live stream. You will be able to see everything. A live stream. 2 polished camera angles. Professional lighting. My grandson receiving a sacrament. And me watching from a device in my kitchen because I did not match the shot. I closed my eyes for a moment. One more question, I said. Did you fight for me? The silence that followed that question was the most honest thing Garrison had said in days. Then, almost a whisper, Dad, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. And that was the moment I stopped making excuses for him. I sat at my office window that afternoon, looking out at the harbor, and I thought about Lorraine. She had died on a Tuesday morning in October, and the last practical instruction she had given me was simple. Well, don't let our boy forget where he comes from. I had failed, not by being generous. Generosity is not a failure. But I had confused generosity with purchase. I had believed that if I kept paying, kept helping, kept smoothing the road, the people I was paying for would eventually choose me back. They would see what I was worth and decide freely to let me in. What I had actually done was teach them that I was always available, that my presence was optional, but my money was not, that the door could be closed in my face because I would stand there patiently, holding the invoice for the door. Beverly knocked and asked what I wanted to do. I told her to get Bettina Pelham Ashcroft on the phone, not Sterling, his daughter-in-law, who ran the daily operations of the family's affairs and understood money more honestly than any of them liked to admit. 2 minutes later, the line connected. Bettina answered the way people do when they have been managing a powerful family's reputation for a long time, smooth. Composed. Slightly bored. Mr. Thornberry, she said. To what do I owe the pleasure? Bettina, I said, leaning back in my chair. I'm going to ask you one business question, and I'd appreciate a straight answer. How is the Pelham Ashcroft mortgage looking this quarter? The silence on the line changed immediately. It became a different kind of quiet. I'm sorry, she said. Commonwealth Heritage Bank. I continued. The note on the Louisburg Square house. I sit on the board. I'm asking because your sister-in-law just informed me that I am not refined enough to attend my own grandson's baptism, a ceremony I am paying for in full. So before I continue funding the family image, I'd like to understand the family finances. Another silence, longer than the first. Mr. Thornberry, she said carefully. That is not something I'm in a position to discuss. No, I said quietly, but we both know you would have denied it if everything were fine. She said nothing. That was my answer. I thanked her and ended the call. Beverly looked at me. They're behind. 6 months. If I had to estimate, I did not intend to ruin anyone. That was never the point. The Pelham Ashcrofts and their mortgage were not my concern. But I needed them to understand, for the first time, that the elegant old Boston world they had used to dismiss me was built on ground I partially owned. Beverly made calls that afternoon. Not threats, not pressure, not pulled leases or frozen accounts or favors weaponized. Simply the truth, offered plainly to the people who had already spent years dealing fairly with me. Every vendor involved in Theodore's baptism was asked one question. Were they comfortable providing services for an event from which the man paying every invoice had been excluded? Because he did not match the aesthetic? That was all. No one was told what to decide. No one was asked to cancel. No instructions were given about what the correct response should be. I simply stopped hiding the insult. I stopped absorbing it and calling it family. And the people who had known me for years made their own choices. By 2:15 in the afternoon, Cordelia's phone had started ringing. By 5 o'clock, 11 calls had come in. The caterer first, then the church, then the florist, the photographer, the lead violinist, the rental company for the chairs and linens, on by on. Without coordination, the vendors who made up the architecture of her ceremony began stepping back. Not because I told them to, because they heard the truth and decided they did not want to be part of the story it told. Cordelia spent the afternoon calling backup vendors. Every call ended the same way. The kitchen space was shared with Verdant, the original caterer. The warehouse for the rental equipment belonged to a company that did business with my firm. The alternate photographer had worked 3 events I had underwritten in the past 2 years. She had built her perfect ceremony inside my world. And she had built it without ever acknowledging that the world existed. By 5:30, the reality had landed. The baptism was in 5 days, and nothing was in place. At 5:34, my phone rang. My phone rang. Garrison. I let it ring twice. Dad. His voice was already breaking. Dad. What did you do? That question told me everything I needed to know about where his mind was. Not? Are you all right? Not? I'm sorry. I should have stood up for you. Not? We need to talk about what this family has been doing to you for 3 years. Just panic. Because the beautiful little production his wife had built was coming apart at the seams. I didn't do anything. I said, I asked some questions. Other people made their own choices. Cordelia is falling apart. He said, her mother has been on the phone with the church for an hour. Father Caldwell won't call back. Everyone is canceling. Then everyone heard the truth. You can't do this. Theodore's baptism is in 5 days. I haven't done anything. Garrison. Vendors were asked if they were comfortable working an event where the man funding the entire thing had been cut from the guest list. They answered. He went quiet. Then, quietly, please, Dad, we can fix this. I'll talk to Cordelia. No, I said, I am not fixing this. I am not calling in favors. I am not smoothing things over so everyone can go back to pretending I do not exist until the next invoice arrives. Dad, the only person who can fix this is your wife. And the only way she fixes it is by inviting me. In person. With a proper apology. To my grandson's baptism. He went silent again. Then he said, almost in a whisper, her mother will never allow that. Then there will be no baptism on Sunday. I put down the phone. That night, around 9, my front door buzzer rang. I checked the camera and saw Garrison standing on my porch in the rain. Alone. His coat was soaked through. His shoulders were lower than I had ever seen them. Even at the funeral. I let him in. He stood in my foyer for a long moment, dripping onto the floor, looking down. Like a man who had arrived somewhere he should have arrived much sooner and did not know how to explain the delay. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were red. Dad, he said, Mom would be ashamed of me. That was the first honest thing he had said in 3 days. I did not pull him in immediately. I did not wrap my arms around him and tell him everything was fine. Because everything was not fine, and some lessons lose their weight if you rescue a man from them too quickly. Come and sit down, I said. We went into the kitchen. I poured 2 glasses of bourbon, and we sat across from each other at the island. The same way we had sat when he was 16 and had something difficult to confess. He told me the truth that night. All of it. He told me that every time Sterling Pelham Ashcroft had called me the developer instead of my name, he had said nothing. Every time Cordelia's mother made a comment about my accent or my neighborhood or my watch, he had changed the subject. Every time Cordelia rolled her eyes when I left the room, he had let it pass. He had told himself he was keeping the peace. He understood now that he had been selling me to buy it. When Theodore was born, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, and I watched you cry in that corridor. I cried too. Not because of him, because I knew he was going to love you in a way I had been letting them prevent. And I let it happen because I was too much of a coward to say, stop. I listened. I did not rush him. When he finished, I told him I forgave him. I meant it completely. But I also told him that forgiveness was not a return to what had been. Forgiveness was a step forward. And the step forward required honesty that he had not yet delivered to the most important person in the room. Not me. His wife. Tell Cordelia exactly what you told me tonight. I said, write it down if you have to. Because the only way your marriage survives what happened this week is if you stop protecting the peace at the cost of the truth. He nodded. He left the kitchen that night looking lighter and heavier at the same time. Which is exactly how a man looks when he has finally put something down that he should have put down years ago. The following morning, at 10:47, Beverly buzzed my office. Wallace, your daughter-in-law is in the lobby. Send her up. I said. Cordelia arrived in a beige cashmere coat. Her hair pulled back. Her eyes tired in a way that no amount of Pelham Ashcroft composure could fully conceal. She sat down when I indicated the chair, which was the first time she had waited for my invitation. I came to apologize, she said. Her voice was not steady. What I said in that text was wrong. You should be at Theodore's baptism. You should be standing at the front of that church with us. He let a moment pass. Why did you send it? I asked. She held my gaze for as long as she could before looking down. My mother said you would embarrass the family. She said finally. She said the photographer's portfolio was very specific and that the image they were building with Father Caldwell required consistency. I let her convince me that asking you not to attend was a logistical decision rather than what it actually was. And what was it actually? She was quiet for a moment. It was me choosing my mother's opinion over my husband's father. She said, it was me treating you like a problem to be managed instead of a person to be respected. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I sent the text. I sent it anyway. I appreciated that she did not look for a softer version of the truth. I told her plainly what I had needed to say since the night of the text. Cordelia, I am not polished. I do not have a hyphenated name or a family crest or ancestors who arrived in 1635. I grew up in Dorchester and I built everything I have from the ground up with my hands and my stubbornness. I am fully aware that I do not photograph the way your mother would prefer. I leaned forward slightly, but I built the floor your family is standing on, and I will not be managed out of a room I paid for. She began to cry. The quiet, involuntary kind. Not performance. I did not comfort her immediately. Some things need to be felt completely before the comfort means anything. When she had composed herself, I told her how this would proceed. The original baptism was canceled. There was not enough time to rebuild it properly. And I had no intention of rewarding a week of chaos with a rushed reinstatement of the same ceremony that had excluded me. We would reschedule for the first Sunday of November. Father Caldwell could officiate if he was willing. The ceremony would be small. Immediate family. People who loved Theodore more than they cared about how the occasion would be described to acquaintances. The reception would be held at my house in Wellesley. There would be no imported linens. No string quartet performing for an audience trying to impress one another. No $300 plates of food with French names. There would be pasta, bread, beer, family photographs, and people I actually trusted. Cordelia's parents were welcome to attend. They would sit in the back row. They would be civil. They would make no comments about the catering, the house, my accent, or my choice of clothing, and Cordelia would write Garrison a letter, by hand, in her own words, telling him exactly what she had told me about why she sent the text. Why, she asked. Because once you write the truth in your own handwriting, I said, you cannot spend the next 10 years pretending you never lived inside it. She agreed to everything. The first Sunday of November arrived quiet and cold and clear. The Church of the Advent felt different that morning. Smaller. The light came through the windows at a low angle and landed on the floor in long pale strips. Father Caldwell stood at the altar in his vestments, calm and unhurried. The room held about 30 people. Garrison's college roommate and his wife, 3 of my oldest friends from the early days in Dorchester, 2 of Cordelia's cousins who had always been kind to me. Sterling and Eleanor Pelham Ashcroft sat in the 3rd row and said nothing that was not required of them. I stood at the front, not as a guest who had been permitted to attend, not as the man whose money had bought the candles and the church flowers and the reception food. As a grandfather, when Father Caldwell called me forward, Theodore reached for me the moment I stepped close enough. Both arms up, fingers opening and closing the way babies do when they have decided you belong to them. I lifted him from Cordelia's arms and held him against my chest. And he grabbed the lapel of my jacket and looked up at me with those dark, uncomprehending eyes. He had no idea what that day had cost us to arrive at. But I did. And standing there in that quiet church with my grandson in my arms and my son beside me, for the first time in longer than I could measure, I felt like I had not been erased. I had been found. The reception at my house in Wellesley was everything the original baptism was not meant to be. Long tables in the dining room, covered not in custom linens, but in the old blue tablecloths Lorraine had bought at a market in Gloucester 20 years ago. Dishes brought by people who had cooked them in their own kitchens. A cake someone made by hand. Photographs of Theodore taped to the walls. People laughing because they actually knew each other, not because the setting required it. Sterling Pelham Ashcroft stood near the fireplace most of the afternoon, holding a glass of wine, speaking when spoken to. At one point, he shook my hand with both of his and called me Wallace for the first time. Not the developer. Not a category. My name? I do not know what Garrison had said to him before that afternoon. I did not ask. In the weeks that followed, something in the family slowly adjusted itself. Garrison and Cordelia began coming to Sunday dinner every week. He no longer arrived with bottles chosen to impress. He brought a simple Chianti from the grocery store and set it on the counter without ceremony. Cordelia came quieter than before, which was not the same as cold. It was the particular quietness of someone who has had to put down something heavy and is still getting used to the new weight of their own hands. Theodore, for his part, took to sitting in my lap at the dinner table and pulling at my collar while I tried to eat. I considered this a fair arrangement. One night, about 3 weeks after the baptism, Garrison said something I had not expected. He leaned back from the table, turned his glass in his hand, and said, "Dad, I want to start paying you back." I shook my head. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "That's exactly why I want to. I want to understand what it means to be responsible for something. Not because you're keeping score, because I want to be the kind of man who understands what things actually cost." Cordelia, sitting across from him, nodded once. Not dramatically. Just a small, honest nod. I looked at them both for a moment. Then I said, "You don't owe me money. You never did. What you owe me is what you've already started to give me, which is the truth." He held my gaze. "Don't spend the next 20 years being convenient." I told him, "Be honest. Be uncomfortable when honesty is uncomfortable. Fight for the people who deserve it, even when it costs you something. That's all I ever wanted from you." He did not say anything for a moment. Then he picked up his glass. "Mom would have loved tonight," he said, and I thought he was probably right. Looking back, the hardest truth was not that they excluded me from that ceremony. The hardest truth was that I had spent years helping to teach them that exclusion was possible. Every check I wrote without expecting respect in return was a lesson. Every insult I swallowed and called patience was a lesson. Every time I smoothed over a slight because I did not want to make Garrison's life difficult. I was teaching the people around him that I was a resource rather than a person. That I could be rescheduled. That I could be moved to the live stream. Respect is not purchased. It is not negotiated with college funds or down payments or $100,000 baptism budgets. It is either given freely or it is withheld. And when it is withheld for long enough, the only honest response is to stop making the withholding comfortable. I did not destroy my daughter-in-law's ceremony. I stopped paying for my own erasure. And when I stood still long enough for the truth to settle, my son came looking for his father. Not for the checkbook. Not for the smooth roads. For the man his mother had asked him not to forget. That was the only outcome I had needed. The people you love will sometimes only see your heart after you remove your wallet from the room. They will sometimes only understand your silence after you stop being convenient. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is not rescue someone from the consequences of how they have treated you. Sometimes you let the consequences arrive, and then you hold the door open when the right person finally comes back through it. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Would you have stayed quiet and let things unfold the way Wallace did, or would you have confronted the family much sooner? Tell me what you would have done. And if you believe that dignity, once reclaimed, changes everything, subscribe to the channel. We bring you a new story every week. Real, honest, and always worth staying for.